Good evening, everyone. My name is Steve Bowen. I'm the Dean of Oxford College, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Oxford College 2009 Founders Week Lecture. Emory University is, by American standards, a pretty old institution. It's 173 years old. The original charter was issued in 1836. The first classes were taught in 1837. Those of us who live and work on the Oxford campus use buildings and are surrounded by buildings that are the oldest and represent the early days of Emory University. Old Church was built in 1840. Phi Gamma was built in 1850. These are buildings that we use almost every day, and they're part of our daily lives. Emory University, from the beginning, was directly involved in or associated with a number of events that are important in American history. Relevant to this evening's lecture is a story that many of you are now familiar with, one in which the schism in the Methodist Church occurred over Oxford resident Bishop Andrew's ownership of the slave kitty. And that conflict prefigured the Civil War. Emory's challenge in the U.S. Supreme Court of a Georgia state law that prohibited racial integration of colleges and universities was instrumental in overturning that law, and it contributed significantly to the American Civil Rights Revolution. The Emory sense of history is sufficiently strong that Emory authors have produced two recent books describing the university's history. One of those is by Dr. Gary Hawk. Its title is A Legacy of Heart and Mind, Emory Since 1836. And the other is by our own Dean Joe Moon, entitled An Uncommon Place, Oxford College of Emory University, 1914 to 2000. Given our deep appreciation and awareness of the historical character of this campus and Emory University, it's fitting that on the Oxford campus we should celebrate the Emory Founders Week with a probing examination of the roles played by those associated with Emory in shaping the world that we have inherited. No one is better able to lead us in such an historical examination than Oxford College Associate Professor of History, Dr. Susan Ashmore. Dr. Ashmore is a genuine Southerner. She was born in Houston, Texas. She earned a Bachelor of Arts degree from the University of Texas at Austin, a Master of Arts degree from the University of Virginia, and a PhD degree from Auburn University. Her doctoral research examined how the federal anti-poverty program sponsored by President Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty helped to implement the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act in the Black Belt of Alabama. Dr. Ashmore is an active member of many professional organizations, and she's a well-published scholar. Most recently, just last year, the University of Georgia Press published her book entitled Carry It On, The War on Poverty and the Civil Rights Movement in Alabama in 1964 to 1972. Her talk for us this evening, she has given the intriguing title, Thoughts on White Supremacy, Atticus Haygood, the White Southern Moderates, and the New South. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ashmore.
Thank y'all for coming out on this cold night. I have to admit, about a week ago I was hoping for snow, but I'm feeling good now. So I wanted to thank Dean Bowen for asking me to look into Haygood and prepare this Founders Day lecture. It was a real pleasure to spend some time ruminating and going through his own papers, and so I really appreciate that opportunity. And I wanted to thank Cynthia Millsaps and Joan Bailey. They do such an amazing job with our Oxford Studies program, and it's not easy, and it really is nice to be asked to work on this program and know it's going to run smoothly. So thanks so much for that. And then I wanted to thank Patrick Jameson. He's doing an independent study with me, and we've read a couple of books already this semester that have helped in my development of ideas about Haygood, and Patrick's really, his ideas have helped me a lot, so I'm appreciative of that. And then I need to thank my husband because he's had to live with me and Atticus Haygood for a few weeks and has really helped me in some conversations. So anyway, so thanks a lot. All right. So I wanted to begin tonight thinking about Barack Obama's election. It's led many to comment on the historic nature of Americans voting a black man into our highest office. And on November 5th, I heard some say this day was 40 years in the making, and others said 400 years. So in honor of Founders Week and taking the position of 150 years, more in the middle of those two, at least since the end of slavery and the Civil War, I thought I could use the life and work of Bishop Atticus Greene Haygood as one way to explain why it has taken us so long to get here. So you can see from these political cartoons that quickly after Obama's election, we were automatically given these historical themes. And then he nurtured them himself by using Lincoln's Bible as his swearing-in for his swearing-in ceremony. So I have to tell you, the old bishop is a complicated figure. For the students who are here tonight, he is the person whose quote is on the sign as you leave campus in front of the Student Center that says, "Let us stand by what is good and make it better if we can." Over these few months of working on this talk, I've wrestled with his views and ideas, trying to make sense out of his perspective, so I could come to some conclusions about his legacy. My husband has had to live with me and Haygood through these weeks and help me work through this over many a conversation. And when one of my students and I read the book Haygood is most famous for, Our Brother in Black, His Freedom and His Future, we both winced at many of his ideas, while we admired other ways he tried to make the South's peace more livable. The South is so different today that my student said reading Haygood was like reading a history of a foreign country. For me, what makes Haygood such a conundrum is that his life straddled two worlds. Historian Paul Gaston has said that this generation grew up sensing the passage from one way of life into another. Haygood developed his worldview during the days of slavery, and as the New South grew up around him after 1865, he used the lens of the Old South to make sense of this new place he had found. Gaston helps us understand why this generation is hard to pin down. The New South spokesmen directed their program to the present and to the future. Their purpose was to rectify the errors of the past. At the same time, they understood the attachment which bound Southerners to their historic memories and were aware of the swollen meaning that now inflated the Southern past as a result of defeat. In this situation, the New South spokesman understood instinctively that no program of reform could do violence to a universally cherished past and hope to succeed. So what I want to do tonight is look at the years between 1865 and 1896, essentially from the end of the war to the beginning of legal segregation, to see what solutions Haygood offered and why they could not last. Atticus Haygood was born in 1839 in Watkinsville. He grew up satisfied deep in the bosom of the region. His parents were devout Southern Methodists who owned 2 slaves and reared their children in the rural and urban South. When he was 13, the family moved to Atlanta, where his father opened a law practice. During his childhood, Haygood suffered from epileptic seizures. That meant he grew up close to an enslaved man known as Uncle Jim, who had to be with Atticus anytime he was outside. And as a young adult of 18, he began his life's vocation preaching to enslaved people as part of the Methodist Episcopal Church South's mission to slaves. Haygood came of age during the national debates over the expansion of slavery, worshiping God in a denomination formed over one of those fights, and attending college in Bishop James Osgood Andrews' neighborhood. He graduated from Emory College on the eve of the Civil War and lived through the upheavals of war and Reconstruction, officially starting his career as a chaplain in the Confederate Army, caring for wounded soldiers of the Battle of Atlanta. As president of Emory College, he became a voice of the New South, providing his own solutions to what was called at the time the Negro problem, that he hoped would foster national reconciliation more to his liking. As we look at how he navigated through these tumultuous times, we can see the ways the institution of slavery created a culture of white supremacy that was not defeated when the last federal soldiers left the South in 1877. So tonight I want to focus on Atticus Haygood as a way to clarify why it will take generations to dismantle this culture of white supremacy. To get our bearings, I want to read from two very different sources that will enable us to imagine living in Georgia just after the Civil War ended. I will begin with the remembrance from Haygood that he wrote in 1892, and then read two poems written in 2008. I didn't do this in the right order. Here he is. How do I go back? Sorry. All right. I will begin with a remembrance from Haygood that he wrote in 1892, and then read two poems written in 2008 by Kevin Young, the Atticus Haygood Professor of English and Creative Writing at Emory University. Here is how Haygood remembered these years. A bishop from Americus, 1866, sent me to a district embracing 9 counties of northwest Georgia. There was one railroad and a piece of one. Armies tramped and fought through it in 1864 and 65. In 1866, the crops failed. These were everything to do and there was everything to do and less to do it with than young preachers in their piping times of peace can imagine. Everything was at loose ends. Nothing was organized. Many of our best supporters had refugeed as the flame of war crept nearer to them. Some never returned. Those who got back found desolation. Fences burned and many houses and homes. Horses and mules were scarce. Broken down army stock were counted as treasure. Cows were as scarce as horses, and of hogs there were very few. There was in 1866 hardly enough poultry to make a new start with. Fried chicken was at a premium. The scarcity of money can hardly be exaggerated. Many churches had been burned or torn down. Others damaged almost to ruin. Some preachers were afoot, others rode sorrier horses than ever carried itinerants before. Georgia was in the throes of Reconstruction, a condition of things in some respects more demoralizing than war. Not a few of our people were utterly discouraged. For example, now he's going to start talking about this Northern Methodists that are in their midst and how upset he is by having these Northerners down south. Through the entire districts, men called missionaries of the Mother Church were going to and fro, prophesizing the disintegration and absorption of the rebel church. They were well paid from a plethoric treasury beyond the Potomac, and they believed that the church they warred against was on its last legs. That confidence dismayed some of our people, a very few of whom went with the newcomers. But their last minute shows how some prophecies fail and come to naught. Most of us were young men, and all are poor. There was not a decent parsonage in the district, nor moderate support for any preacher. So clearly Haygood was what was happening to his denomination bothered him. And we need to make sure we understand the defensiveness of the Southern Methodists as Northern Methodists competed for Dixie's souls. The two poems I'll read next by Young will help us understand these years from an African American perspective. Poetry can often transport us to a place more effectively than a secondhand explanation. These poems are part of his collection titled For the Confederate Dead, and these two in particular are part of a 5-poem series titled Nicodemus, being a true account of the flight of freedmen during redemption to the colored Canaan. And I have written that out so you can follow along. Sometimes it's hard when someone reads a poem, so I thought it would be easier for you. So those slash marks indicate the end of a stanza. So the first one is called Flame. Soon as I saw the song I knew, dropped my plow, unhitched and headed to where Blue sported 2 hoes, hauling much as 2 men. Said, I swear, Blue, it's so good we're already gone. I couldn't tell him what it said, just lured him like a moth from the hot lamp of the field and pointed, Ho, Kansas. The ad read, he said, good land, good water and rocks, good wood on the streams, only $5 a passage. Nicodemus, now ain't that name the sweetest heard since your own? Finished reading aloud, Blue just sat in his indigo, sweaty and shook. No one could cover the country mile of that man's smile, not even his gals at them dances. But here he sat shaking his head till blue as his shirt and name. Didn't say a word. But didn't need to. We'd been brothers since Big Massa died and told us so. Called me son, though don't tell that to the widow, 'cause she don't like to hear what she already know. Me, I just left Blue there, gathered Lucy and Moses and the rest to say what I'd heard. We all knew of the blood in those parts. The man Carolina hung and made sure we'd heard about. No one named anyone Nate for years. But now we could go and pioneer our own brand of unbranded freedom. No more patty rollers and night raiders, only the same stone welcome of the land. Well, looky here, settlements along River Solomon. But most would have none of it. Moses said Mrs. needed us in the house, and cuss don't know who this nickel demon is. But I sure about one thing, he ain't here or home. I agreed with Moses and reminded everyone of bad butter, how this South's redemption didn't want us, how the town tried to ghost us out of the vote. No chords, words, only nods in the small crowd, grown men acting like sheep scared of sin. My folks done this here, Dixie, since you were only Dix, Blue said, sad. Only Black Tom stood and said, I want to be alive, not y'all who are dead and don't know it. And then the second poem is called Air. Freedom what we already had, only we were too dumb to say it. Speak up, girl, the white man said, but Lucy'd been mostly mute since they'd taken our son from her. Sir, I said, I better tell her myself, and did. They wouldn't let us cross with Black Tom's trunk or her daddy's walking stick. Said she'd have to leave them ashore or have them sent. No needs no translation, and neither did her sorrow. They sent the stick and trunk overboard like so much heavy hay. We'd made Orleans 3 days and camped at the bank. I couldn't sleep or wait for the committee of colored folks to meet. Awake, watched the water carried out to sea, pictured slaves shivering, sold, or shucked overboard like cotton cobs from Missouri, where they say a colored man can't walk. Next day, the boats left bound for Kentucky and Kansas, coming from far as Tennessee and St. Louis, just to spot free soil, call it your own. The committee and colony already paid. All we needed was what we had, 1 mule a year, saved up in some backs and hands unafraid of work. So we set out without a thought or second to waste, and my Lucy began to hum. What I hadn't heard since she found our son, fetch me quiet to cut his body down. So in the words of Haygood and Young's freedmen and women, we can hear the sense of grief, of loss, of conflict, of yearning, and of confession and uncertainty, but for very different reasons. These voices remind us of what will follow, how the South will reform in the wake of emancipation, and all that that means for both Black and white Southerners. Finally, let me just say a little bit about Reconstruction in Georgia, so you can see how fast the ways of the Old South were challenged and how quickly its supporters tried to restore their familiar traditions. In addition to the Northern missionaries of the Mother Church, Haygood also had to worry about people like Henry McNeil Turner, a Union chaplain and minister in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, who remained in Georgia ministering to freed slaves and becoming a leader in the Republican Party. Fearing the ability of the AME Church and the northern branches of Methodism to radicalize freed people, the Southern Methodist leaders organized a Black branch of Southern Methodism that would exist under the direct influence and indirect control of the Southern White Church. By 1870, the colored Methodist Episcopal Church formed and came under the direct control of African Americans, although strong ties between the two denominations remained. The white Southern Methodists gave their black brethren the church property that had originally been used as the mission to enslave people, in exchange to promising not to use their churches for political activity. As a result of this bargain, the CME, the Colored Methodist Episcopals at the Southern Methodist Episcopal Church at that time, were often referred to as the Old Slavery Church. Like the other former Confederate states, Georgia's Reconstruction era was fraught with political turmoil, including pitched battles between Republicans and Democrats. In September 1868, racial violence erupted during a Republican rally in Camilla that ended with 12 black people being killed and several white people being wounded. This violence, coupled with Georgia's refusal to ratify the 15th Amendment, meant that federal troops would not leave the state until 1870. 2 years later, the Democratic Party gained back control of the state. So historian Jennifer Ritterhouse sums this up nicely when she writes, "The end of slavery had upset legal definitions of black social status, while the devastation of the Civil War and the policies of congressional Reconstruction had shaken the economic and political foundations of white power. Even more important, African Americans were not always agreeably docile and hardworking, nor did they always stay where whites wanted them to, matching land and labor." So that helps us have a sense of what Atticus Haygood is entering into when he becomes the president of Emory in 1875. So let's see what happens here. So Atticus Haygood came back to Oxford. Oh no. I'm sorry, y'all. Came back to Oxford in 1875, 2 years after Georgia had been redeemed by the Democratic Party, 5 years after ratification of the 15th Amendment that established the right to vote regardless of color, race, or previous condition of servitude, and 8 years after the ratification of the 14th Amendment that recognized citizenship for all people born in the United States and therefore granted them the equal protection of the law and the due process of law. Haygood bought the old Few home, which is now the dean's residence, and the Board of Trustees elected him president of the college that December. Emory was in financial trouble, probably due to the upheaval of the war and its aftermath, as well as its generosity to a third of the students who did not pay tuition because they were sons of Methodist ministers and came from Methodist districts in Georgia and Florida. The college had an endowment of $13,000 and a debt of $30,000, and most of the buildings were inadequate. And I found evidence of this poverty in a very mundane place. You can see here, that's the faculty in 1875. That's it. How many men is that? 8 professors. And so one thing that I found, in the archives, I was researching in the Haygood family papers and I found a box of his sermons. And as I was going through the sermons, they're handwritten, and I noticed that he would reuse paper. So the handwriting is it's the front part of his sermon, and that is some used piece of stationery from Oxford that he reused to write his sermons on. And we probably view that as sustainable and ecologically good today, but to me that's a sign of poverty. That paper was such a precious thing, he couldn't part with it if the back was still clear. He could use it. So what launches Haygood into the realm of a New South spokesman is a sermon he gave to the students at Emory College and the people of Oxford on Thanksgiving Day, November 25th, 1880. Originally calling his homily The New South, Gratitude, Amendment, Hope, a Thanksgiving sermon, Haygood's biographer has written that an article in the Wesleyan Advocate that raised concerns about the Negro problem in relation to the 1878 elections is what influenced the Emory president to deliver his message. The February 22, 1879 article said that black voters held the balance of power in that election. And I'm quoting from the article, "Ignorant and poor, thoughtless and impulsive, taught in a bad school of politics since the beginning of his citizenship. No wonder that he is sought by corrupt men as the means of elevation to office. Each citizen, black or white, helps to determine the moral tone of the state. We cannot afford for the Negro to remain in ignorance and vice. We must furnish white Southern teachers." I'm a bit suspicious of this article. It is not clear exactly what these African American voters were doing other than exercising their right to vote independently. What is clear is that the author understood that to mean they were being taught in a bad school of politics since the beginning of his citizenship is what he was worried about. From the perspective of paternalism, a correction of some sort seemed vital. Haygood took up the challenge and used his sermon to chart a course forward to reconciliation in his mind, bringing safety and security to his region, his denomination, and his neighbors, black and white. It is significant that he waited until Thanksgiving to give his sermon. At this point, most Southerners considered this a Yankee custom because Abraham Lincoln had declared it an official holiday of the United States during the Civil War. So to me, Haygood's intentionality signals his purpose in forging a path to reunion, but always on his terms, looking to the present and the future while never letting go of his ties to the Old South. To legitimize the Pilgrim Feast, he opens by explaining that nearly all nations in both ancient and modern times have incorporated into their religious and social customs annual thanksgivings for the blessings that crown each year. From the pulpit of Old Church, he explained, your classic literature, young gentlemen of the college, will tell you of many festivals celebrated by the Greeks and the Romans that publicly recognize the gifts of the gods and the vintage and harvests of their fields. These festivals were a part of their social and religious life. I cannot conceive of anything more becoming than that a Christian nation would celebrate a day of universal thanksgiving to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father also of all men and the giver of all good. Haygood made it possible to look to the example of the Greeks and Romans to keep Lincoln's hovering presence from clouding the day. He tells those present that they should honor this holiday because our rulers have commanded it. We are here in obedience to the proclamations from the chief executives, both of our nation and state. Haygood flatly stated that it was not only a privilege but their duty to meet together on this particular day to unite in public thanksgiving to Almighty God for his manifold and great mercies. In all things legal, lawful, as tested by the greater law of God, it is a Christian man's duty to obey those in authority. Haygood gives us a key to his map of progress by opening his sermon in this way. Hierarchy is important to him. It represents the arc of his worldview, which is quite telling. The foundation of the whole doctrine, the foundation truth of the whole doctrine is this: whoever administers legitimate authority represents, insofar as his office and functions go, God. The principle and the obligation are the same, whether it be the president, the governor, the local magistrate, the town marshal, the college professor, the village mistress, the employer. In a word, whoever bears rightful rule does in his sphere, whether it be great or small, represent God. Be it remembered, furthermore, the obligation does not depend upon the personal character of the rulers, but upon the fact of their authority. I can't imagine saying that to my students and them really believing that a professor had that kind of power. Standing on the sure footing of his authority, then, Haygood proceeds to the heart of his sermon, to mention some reasons why we of the South should both thank God and take courage. He expresses gratitude for all the economic progress that has been made since 1865, for the return to social and civil order, and for the restoration of our relations with the general government. But most importantly, he says, there was one great historic fact which should, in my sober judgment, above all things, excite everywhere in the South profound gratitude to Almighty God. I mean the abolition of African slavery. He repeats again to make his emphasis, I, for one, thank God that there is no longer slavery in these United States. If respect for authority is the arc of his worldview, this gratitude of slavery's demise rests at its heart. Through his explanation of how the South's peculiar institution came to an end, we can see how he is using his Old South lens to make sense out of the present and future. He is quick to make sure the congregation does not misunderstand his delight in emancipation as a criticism of slavery, as the South practiced it. In his mind, slavery was lawful. I do not forget the better characteristics of African slavery as it existed among us for so long a time under the sanction of national law and under the protection of the Constitution of the United States. Those who called for its abolition were mistaken about its brutalities in his mind. He says, I do not forget that its worst features were often cruelly exaggerated and that its best were unfairly minified. And most of all, the mission to slaves begun by the Methodist Episcopal Church South, he did not want to be dismissed. So he says in the sermon, more than all, I do not forget that in the providence of God, a work that is without parallel in history was done on the southern plantations, a work that was begun by such men as Bishop Capers of South Carolina, Lubbock Pierce, and Bishop Andrew of Georgia, and by men like-minded with them, a work that expenses were met by the slaveholders themselves, a work that resulted in the Christianization of a full 500,000 of these African people, who became communicants of our churches, and of nearly the whole 4 or 5 millions who were brought largely under the all-pervasive and redeeming influence of our holy religion. So here is the pro-slavery argument that many Southerners used beginning in 1830s that grew into what Drew Gilpin Faust has called a social movement by the 1850s. This movement sought to explain why slavery was right and how its justice could be demonstrated. This was the world of Haygood's childhood. Most of the arguments of the pro-slavery literature were grounded in a religious defense. Presbyterian minister and fellow Georgian Charles Colcock Jones articulated this view with the 1842 publication of his book, The Religious Instruction of the Negroes. He argued that blacks were placed under our control, not exclusively for our benefit, but for theirs also, so they could receive moral and religious uplift. We cannot disregard this obligation, thus divinely imposed, without forfeiting our humanity, our gratitude, our consistency, and our claim to the spirit of Christianity itself. Using the Bible to back up their claims, Joel Williamson finds that this role flattered the white man's image of himself. He was the superior, the Spartan warrior and the winner. The Negro was the subordinate. The white man was the Christian, civilized gentleman carrying the message to the heretofore heathen and savage black. He was doing God's work in the Southern world, and it was a labor that would earn him grace in the hereafter. Historians have noted that as these ideas took hold, slave owners began to refer to their slaves as their people, and a system of paternalism developed based on mutual obligations. Slaves deserved care and support in exchange for loyalty and work. Yet Peter Colchin reminds us slaveholder paternalism encompassed behavior with sharply divergent implications. So long as their authority was unquestioned, most slave owners could accentuate their soft side, represented by honor, duty, and noblesse oblige. But even under the best of circumstances, paternalism was often indistinguishable from petty tyranny. The same master who nursed the sick, read the Bible to his people, and expressed real affection for a childhood chum or a beloved nanny could also drive, whip, and sell with steely determination. we must always remember that this was a movement to try to blunt the harsh criticism that abolitionists leveled against the South for its commitment to slavery, which meant slavery's evils got minimized and what positive aspects there were got maximized. Haygood could believe fully and completely in the goodness of this antebellum paternalistic system for several reasons. First, he grew up in the most benign setting of slavery, in a household that had 2 slaves, and one was Uncle Jim, his childhood protector. Second, he was a minister in a denomination that forged its very identity in defending slavery. And third, he was not a slaveholder himself, so he never had to face the realities of using the whip or the auction block. For him, this was a worldview worth saving. And it is this paternalism that Haygood packed in his bags as he ventured down the road away from the Old South. Haygood's sermon enables us to watch his progression from the missionary minister to both enslaved people and Confederate soldiers, to a voice of reason as the South entered the hardening of racial lines in the 1880s and 1890s. Joel Williamson calls this the liberal revolt. He has found that in the early 1880s, a few thoughtful and highly perceptive Southern conservatives became convinced that Negro life was losing sight of the ideals that whites cherished. They felt that black life, thus bereft, was in danger of disintegrating. Notice where the action is taking place in Williamson's sentence. In other words, who is being blamed for changing the system? It is African Americans who have lost sight of the value of paternalism. It is their independent actions of living more fully free that have cast them loose, thus agitating the violence of some white Southerners and causing other white people to stop caring altogether about their end of the bargain of mutual obligation. As a committed paternalist, Haygood revolted against this apathy of the vast majority of whites in regard to black people that he thought bred ignorance, carelessness, and interracial matters. Williamson notes that this began as a call for a return to the paternalism of late slavery, when the best masters had cared for and raised up the best blacks. What is important for our purposes in understanding Haygood is the optimistic tone of this liberal revolt that believed in the capacities of African Americans, that Williamson says called upon the best of Southern whites to pick up again the cross of labor among their darker brothers. So as a racial moderate in these troubled times, then Haygood's sermon reminded those sitting in Old Church about the mutual obligations that remain between black and white Southerners. Emancipation was best for the Negroes themselves, he said, but the white South had a role to play in their freedom. According to Haygood, how soon they realize the possibilities of their new relations depends largely, perhaps mostly, on themselves, but much depends on those who under God set them free. One way to meet that obligation was for this whole nation to undertake the problem of their education so that they can be helped to help themselves, is how he explained it in his sermon. In the spirit of extending a hand to his black neighbors, Haygood admonished that this we should give them not reluctantly, but gladly, for their good and for the safety of all, for their elevation and for the glory of God. He then closed his sermon by reminding those present of what needed to be corrected in the South. He said it was too provincial. There was a vast mass of illiteracy among us, both black and white, who must be taught. There was a want of literature and need for better educational facilities. Both the public school and colleges and universities lacked adequate funding. He told the congregation, we are 100 years behind the eastern and middle states and many of the new states of the West. He blamed all of this backwardness on slavery, trying to make his audience see that they had much to gain by accepting the reality of the day. He tried to turn the yearning for the Old South on its head. He exclaimed, let us look forward. Again I say, look forward. I do not I do the heroic dead no injustice. But the only rational way in which we can emulate their virtues is to live for the country they died for. He asked them to follow the example of General Robert E. Lee and our General Gordon when it was all over. We must go home and cultivate our virtues. We are to do the work of today, looking forward and not backward. We have no divine call to stand eternal guard by the grave of dead issues. And uttering words that came close to heresy, he said, "My friends, my neighbors, and my pupils, I declare to you today my hope that in 20 years from now, the words 'the South' shall have only a geographical significance. The time has fully come when these truths should be spoken by somebody," he said. "There is nothing weaker or more foolish than repining over an irrevocable past, except it be despairing of a future to which God invites us. Good friends, this is not 1860, it is 1880. So the sermon, as you can imagine, was not a big hit among Haygood's fellow Methodists in the South. Some said Haygood will ruin the college, but he was relieved when enrollment came in at 201 students. He wrote to his colleague and friend H.R. Hendricks that he received scores of letters, nearly all from the North, about that Thanksgiving sermon, but not a line from any so-called leaders in the church anywhere. Our church, I mean, he said. 5 or 6 rather unknown men wrote me, but not one of the older ones. What is to become of us? It nearly breaks my heart to see men so blind and deaf to their age, they stand serenely, winking at each other and back at 1844, while the very ground under their feet is going down. Speaking frankly to his friend, he was exasperated at the deafening silence. In God's name, I cut loose from deaf and blind and dead men and move out to sea. Maybe God will help us. We don't deserve it, but he is long-suffering. Stand by me and I will stand by you, he declared. What torments me most is a few see and are afraid. His answered prayers came from a Northern Railroad capitalist, George I. Seeney. Haygood's sermon got reprinted in the New York Christian Advocate, and Seeney read it. He then ordered 10,000 copies of Haygood's sermon to give away to friends. When Haygood was in New York the next year seeking a publisher for his book, Our Brother in Black, Mr. Seeney asked to see him and offered to donate $10,000 to Emory's endowment. Haygood accepted the gift and then challenged any Georgia Methodist to match the donation. The record does not reveal if anyone took up Haygood's challenge, but Seeney continued his generosity, giving the college $130,000 by the end of 1881. And obviously, you've guessed it, the Seeney Hall is named for that same man. Seeing a good thing coming Oxford way, some of Haygood's neighbors began to write him asking if Seeney had any money to give to them. Here's an example of one of these letters Haygood received on October 28, 1881. And I'm going to read it in the way it was spelled, speaking of illiteracy in the South. Dear brother, will you please write Mr. Seeney and get me $40? I am afflicted with biles and rheumatiz and can't do no work. I make no bales cotton, but I takes it all to buy my provisions. If Mr. Seeney will give me $20 now, I will wait on him for the balance till Christmas. Your brother in the gospel. So Haygood followed the similar themes in from his sermon in his book published the next year titled Our Brother in Black, His Freedom and His Future. Just the title's acknowledgement of a shared humanity, our brother in black, caused controversy for some. Yet we can see familiar themes of the New South spokesman here too, looking forward while defending the past. In the first half of the book, Haygood's paternalistic worldview and apologies for slavery are expanded. And this is the part Patrick and I winced over as we read through Haygood's book. But his support for black education, amending the problems associated with sharecropping, and honoring the contributions of black Methodists made the book a mark of his moderation. As with his Thanksgiving sermon, he received the cold shoulder from fellow Methodists in the South. For several months after its publication, he was not invited to fill a single Southern pulpit. Some called him the nigger college president. And the two debate societies at Emory, Phi and Phi Gamma, held a debate on the value of Negro education. The side that spoke against it won the debate. So this criticism actually must have fueled Haygood's missionary zeal. He had gone to college with young John Allen, who had spent the war years in China. And Haygood's sister was also a missionary in Shanghai, probably because there were no men to marry after the Civil War because so many had died. But he really longed to be a missionary, and so the persecution must have stung, but at the same time probably confirmed for him in his mind that he was doing God's work. Editors of Southern newspapers in growing New South cities were not as critical, for they had a vested interest in seeing the South change in the direction Haygood called for. As Seeney's response to the Thanksgiving sermon confirmed, there was an audience for Haygood's words in the North, especially with those industrialists who saw an opportunity for national reconciliation by supporting this call for a new South. John F. Slater, a Connecticut textile manufacturer, read Haygood's book and then created the Slater Fund in 1882 with a gift of $1 million. The fund was specifically for the uplifting of the lately emancipated population of the southern states and their posterity by conferring on them the blessings of Christian education. This became the first philanthropy in the United States devoted to education for blacks that gave money to private black colleges, four-year high schools, and vocational and industrial training. And Slater asked Haygood to be his first agent, who would distribute the funds as he saw fit across the South. From 1882 until 1891, Haygood worked as the Slater Fund agent. He would resign as the Emory College president in 1885 to continue working more single-mindedly on solving the Negro problem. Over the course of the 9 years in this position, he addressed 500 audiences, giving sermons, speeches, addresses, and talks promoting the cause. He estimated that he traveled 150,000 miles. And imagine that, around the South with bad roads and bumpy horse carriages and things. Haygood distributed Slater Fund money to schools generally regarded as in the tradition of liberal rather than industrial education. But when industrial education was the focus, these were the kinds of jobs that were taught to African Americans: printing, bricklaying, masonry, forge work, carpentry, blacksmithing, shoemaking, wagon making, cabinet making, farming, and animal husbandry. What Haygood found was that industrial education would buy Southern goodwill and Northern philanthropy. When he left the Slater Fund in 1890, his replacement consolidated the philanthropy's bequest to just 2 schools, Hampton and Tuskegee. Thus, all of Haygood's work across the region eventually died on the vine for lack of funds. J.L.M. Curry was the new agent for the Slater Fund, and he had been a slaveholder and a congressman in the antebellum South. In 1890, the Methodist Episcopal Church South appointed Haygood to be the Bishop of California, taking the Southern Methodist view out west. I think in some ways this may have been his chance to leave the Negro problem for other people to wrestle with for a while. By this time, it was clear that the other forces working in the South were not heeding his paternalistic call for reform. In the 1880s, streetcars and trains began to enforce segregated seating. In 1887, Georgia instituted the all-white Democratic primary as a way to restrict the voting power of African Americans. And he and his family only stayed in California for a few years because of his health and his wife's health. And they end up coming back here in 1893. And then Haygood will die in 1896 in January, and he dies in January, and Plessy v. Ferguson, which was the Supreme Court ruling that said separate but equal was constitutional, will put in place legalized segregation across the South. So one of the last things that Haygood wrote in 1893 was where he talked about how long this was going to take, this answering this Negro problem. And I think he was a lot more hopeful when he began this work than when he was at the end of his life. So he talks about how many generations it's going to take, and he said it would be his children's 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 generation, and he calculated that that would be about 1965, which is sort of interesting. That's the year the Voting Rights Act passed. But I think it also indicates his having to come to terms with this idea that his paternalistic view was really not going to work, and that there were forces of people who were more used to the etiquette they learned during slavery of how black and white people should get along. So what do we do now with this knowledge of Haygood on this occasion of Founders Week? First, I think we need to acknowledge the significance of Emory. It says something that Haygood was allowed by this institution to be both president of the college and agent for the Slater Fund. The criticism he received in his own region could have had a different outcome if Emory had not enabled him to continue in this work. It would have been easy to fire him, or easy to not really allow him to continue what he was doing. Second, his history helps us see how the acceptance of segregation in our culture and in our law took hold. And Haygood's words and actions play a role in this. This desire for paternalism still acknowledges black people were not equal. And when he called for black education, he always called for it in separate schools. And I think that the larger forces of the culture were headed in that direction. And even though Haygood's a moderating force, we have to acknowledge that he couldn't even offer something more liberal and still be who he was. That wouldn't have been Atticus Haygood. So I also just wanted to acknowledge the significance that at Emory University we have the Atticus Haygood professor, who is a leading voice in poetry in this country, and also happens to be an African American, which is a nice coming full circle in the way to think about Atticus Haygood, and would be interesting to know what he thinks of Kevin Young's poetry. So, you've indulged me long enough, so those are my conclusions about the old bishop, and I'd be happy to answer any questions if anybody has any. I can't really see you, but if anyone has a question, holler it out.
Hi, Dr. Ashmore.
Hey!
Katie, I have a question.
Yeah.
You said that the two debate societies, you and Vivian, debated on the issue of educating Negroes.
Right.
Which one debated?
Oh, gosh. I should know that, and I can look it up. I didn't even care. Is that still in place?
What's still in place?
Is there a Phi Gamma debate group and a Phi debate group today?
On the books there is, I think, but they're not very active.
Oh, okay. Well, I'd be happy to verify it for you, and where can I put it, on the Oxford Studies Conference or something?
Yeah, we don't ask.
Okay. And also, let me say, I forgot to put it on here. There's a link to his Thanksgiving sermon, and I'll put that on the conference too if you're curious to read that for yourself. So I'll put that up there. Sure. Yeah, just speak up.
You said that he kind of suggested separate schools for African Americans. Do you think that was because he felt that was the best way to educate African Americans, or pretty much that the South wasn't actually ready for it?
I think he wasn't ready for it. I think that in Our Brother in Black, he talks about how, of course, black people want to be with their own and white people want to be with their own. It was kind of going in that direction in his mind. I think that he believed in the humanity, the shared humanity of all people, which makes him in that progressive mode. But he doesn't believe it in his life, in the lifetime. He thinks over generations, black people will eventually get to full equality with white people, but it's not anything he can imagine happening in his own lifetime. So developing the idea that black and white children could not go to school together fits with that worldview to me. But yet, he's still saying they should be educated. And there were other voices in the South at this time who didn't even think black people deserved an education. So we always have to keep Haygood in mind with where he fits in the spectrum of what other people were saying and doing. There were people further to the left who believed in full black equality and were ready for opportunities available on all levels for black people who were white and who were from the South. And there were people who were radical that saying no education, if we lynch people, black people, it doesn't matter. And then Haygood is that moderate in the middle, trying to find both ways. Yeah. Yeah.
You mentioned at the very beginning of your lecture a controversy about Haygood's ownership of the slaves. I'm not familiar with that.
Controversy with his relationship with slaves?
Ownership.
Ownership. That's Bishop Andrew. And why the church splits in 1844. Bishop Andrew had, as abolitionists began to criticize Southern slaveholders, the Methodist Church, when it met in its biannual or triannual meeting, they decided that bishops should not be able to own slaves because in the Methodist tradition, bishops travel all over. And so Bishop Andrew, here living in Oxford, owned slaves and ultimately was unwilling to give them up, and so the church then split in 1844 with a Northern Methodist branch and a Southern Methodist branch. Yeah, and that really is one of the early institutions that divides North and South, where it puts us on a path to eventually Civil War. Yeah. Are you glad Emory's different than today than now? That's for sure. Yeah, go ahead, Steve.
Atticus Haygood is such an interesting character, but we don't hear a lot from him except the quote that we're familiar with.
Yeah.
What do you think that is?
Maybe, I don't know. You mean in the sense that we don't have an understanding of him as a person? He's just more of somebody we quote all the time?
Yes, well, his story is so rich and it's so pivotal.
Yeah.
Historically, yet I learned about it tonight.
Yeah, well, and I think too, when I was doing this research, and I kept running into people calling him the most famous Southern bishop, and I thought, well, why don't I know more about him? And maybe the last biography of him was written in 1965. Maybe he's due for Joe or Gary to write something great about Atticus Haygood. Maybe there's not a lot of records enough. I don't really know. But I do think it's helpful for us to see someone struggling with this. How does he live in these different worlds? And being a committed Christian who can't quite bring himself all the way to where he knows he needs to be. I think James Colcott Jones? What was his first name? The Presbyterian who was pro-slavery and a slave owner. And he actually was going to stay at Princeton and just never come back to the South, and then changed his mind and then made his whole life mission to Christianize slaves and was become an apologist for slavery. So hard for us today to really understand that struggle. Yeah. Any other questions? Well, good. All right. Well, thanks for coming. I enjoyed it.